So good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, depending on where you might be. I hope you're all doing well and staying healthy given the circumstances that we are in, and grateful that we could be together online, even if we couldn't be together in person. So, as you know, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about decolonizing our syllabi. And before we actually get into the session, I want to begin, even if it's an electronic or virtual land acknowledgement. Part of the idea of decolonizing is that it's rooted with our Indigenous and Native American brothers and sisters who were essentially colonized and had their culture and their land taken over. So when we are doing this work, it is important to remember those who came before us, and we should acknowledge specifically the Indigenous peoples of South Carolina. So I want to get started with a very brief video. The video is here. You can see it on the screen. And what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to push you the link. And when the link is pushed to you, and you acknowledge it, it will open up another screen. So what I'm asking you to do is watch the video in your pop-up screen, and when the video is done, you'll need to close that pop-up screen and return back here to Adobe Connect. So as you continue with your impressions, please feel free to do so. This is, for me, why we're here today. So not only does this commercial start getting us to think about implicit biases, and implicit biases are beliefs that we may have that indicate prejudice or stereotypes against folks who are different from us. And implicit biases are often a result of how we're socialized, right? We live in a Western culture that values whiteness, that values Christianity, that values heterosexuality, that values affluence, that values certain things. And when you have folks who are different for a variety of reasons, it is easy for folks that don't fit this mold to be quote unquote othered, or to be marginalized, or to be judged, or to be perceived with prejudice or bias, right? So this is where we're coming from with why was he getting that look? Because he was being judged for various reasons, right? Good or bad. And so when we're talking about decolonizing our syllabus or our syllabi, we're talking about the entire learning environment that we want to provide for our students. We would never want our students to feel that they were othered or marginalized in our classrooms, in our university, in our spaces. And so we want to talk about how we go about doing some internal work, some critical self-reflection, and then at the end we'll talk a little bit about how we might make some of these changes to our classrooms, to our classroom documents. So I mentioned just a moment ago when we're talking about decolonizing, this is really coming again from our Native American and indigenous populations. But when we're talking about decolonizing here, we are talking about making our syllabi and our classrooms more inclusive, right? So this is not about removing voices. This is not about erasure. This is about addition and about enhancing and enriching the content that we are giving to our students. And so this idea, or the reason, one of the reasons that I've been doing this work is this article that was published in the Los Angeles Times in 2018. And this is from Dr. Yvette de Chavez, and she wrote about it's time to decolonize that syllabus. But certainly I'm sure you've all seen things on the internet, decolonize your bookshelf, decolonize this, decolonize that. So it is an idea that is being seen and pushed out in different places, and it really is about diversifying and inclusion. So again, when we're talking about decolonizing, again, it's about the internal work that we need to do as instructors, as educators, as researchers, etc. And so on the screen here, you have a couple of things in red, and this is what we're going to talk about today. And these are just some of the components that I would argue are part of this whole decolonization process, because the decolonization process starts with us. It starts with the internal work that we do. And on the bottom, you have some things in black. We have culturally responsive pedagogy. We have feminist pedagogy. We have anti-racist pedagogy. And there are other pedagogies that are out and about that you may know about, that you may even practice. And these are just meant to be examples of the types of pedagogies that really encourage us to decolonize and be more inclusive in the work that we do. So when we're talking about critical self-reflection, again, the work that you're doing internally to better understand ourselves so we can better understand our students. Empathy. We want to have empathy and compassion for other people, just as we would hope that they would have these things for us. You know, those of us who teach, we know how hectic it can be. I know that a lot of us are feeling the stress even this week when we're moving things online because of the coronavirus. And so things can be very stressful. Sometimes things can be very transactional. And sometimes we need to step back and remember that we're all human beings, and we all need to have that approach, as opposed to you know, we have to teach to the test, or we have to cover all of these things. We do need to work towards certain goals, but we also need to remember that we're dealing with people, and that's part of this idea of having empathy. Cultural competence and humility, I'll get to that in the next couple of slides. But this, again, this idea of being cognizant of those who are different from us, and not seeing those differences as deficits, but really seeing those differences as something that will enhance the whole, right? That will benefit all of us. In racial literacy, just a shout out to Dr. Michelle Bryan in the College of Ed, who gives a great workshop on racial literacy. And really, again, this idea of being cognizant of the differences between us and others, and getting to the point where we can celebrate and really acknowledge those differences and see them as assets. So when we talk about cultural competence, again, this is an ongoing process, this idea of becoming aware of other people's differences and being able to work with those differences and get to the point where you can change your syllabi, your content, your services. I work a lot with librarians, obviously, who work with their communities. And we talk about collections and services and how do you actually enable your diverse populations to see themselves in what it is that you're doing. And so cultural competence, for those who are in applied health sciences, this is a concept that social workers and counselors and nurses and doctors and other frontline workers have been acknowledging for years. And really, we need to be frank, to get over ourselves, and we need to be able to be compassionate and effective with anyone who comes through our doors and needs our help. And so with that, sometimes there is work that needs to be done. So privilege and oppression, right? And we'll talk about privilege and oppression in the next couple of slides. We all have identities that enable us to be privileged in certain spaces. We also have identities that may disadvantage us, and maybe we face some stereotypes or discrimination because of identities that we possess. Cultural and intellectual humility. We need to be able to understand that there's always room to grow and change. And so we don't always know everything. There's always a webinar or another colleague or someone that we can learn from. This idea that there's always room to grow and improve. And lack of diversity in the profession. So, again, I can speak for the library and information science profession, but there are lots of disciplines, and just look at our classrooms in terms of we don't always have the most diverse set of students. We don't always have the most diverse faculty on any given campus, right? South Carolina notwithstanding. And so these are some of the things that we need to be thinking about contextually when we're talking about decolonizing. It is not strictly about changing your readings and changing your syllabi. There are things that need to be done internally. There are things that need to be done externally. There are things that need to be done organizationally, and also things that need to be done in the society at large. So to kind of continue on this idea of intersectionality, I'm sure you've heard this term, and this is put forth by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a legal scholar, but of course this work had been talked about and discussed and been formed by many other Black women scholars. And so when we're talking about intersectionality, we are again talking about identity, right? And how different identities privilege us and how different identities disadvantage us. And these privileges and disadvantages are going to change depending on your identity, right? So for example, as an African American woman, I may have a different set of experiences than a white woman or an Asian American woman. Right, so it's just the combination, and Crenshaw and others refer to it as interlocking oppressions, right, and how the different contexts of our identities and our lives work together to form sometimes oppression, but also to form privileges as well. So we're not going to do this, take too much time with this particular exercise. If we had been able to be in person, we would have done so. But one of the downloads that I have for you is the circles of my multicultural self. And I just want you to take a couple of seconds, a minute or so, to think about the identities, the primary identities that make you make you who you are. And so I just have the top 6 here, or excuse me, 6, not the top 6. But there could be any number of bubbles here, right, with you in the center. There could be any number of things that you identify as characteristics that make you who you are. So you have sexual orientation. SES is socioeconomic status. You have gender identity. You have religion. You have race and ethnicity. You have education level. But you could have lots of other things. And so just take a minute and think about what are the things that make you who you are. So just before we leave this exercise, we've talked about some of this already in the great responses that you typed in. But when I do this with my students, I always give them examples so they know that, I'm going through the same thought processes and things that they are. So if these are just some of the things that I identify with, one of the examples I give is that as a PhD, as many of you typed into the box, being educated, being highly educated, we have jobs that require, a lot of education, and that is the ticket to entry, if you will. So on campus, my education level affords me a lot of privilege, right? But as a African-American woman, as a woman with a visible minority status, if you will, I may still be afraid of law enforcement, and maybe I'm afraid that I'll be pulled over, right? Because when people see me off the campus, or even sometimes on the campus, their first automatic assumption is not that, oh, this woman has a PhD, right? They may very well be, oh, it's a black woman, right? And because we have implicit biases, and because we live in a society where it's just easier to kind of put people in boxes or to label them, you can't see a lot of things, right? So the education level, your religion, unless you wear some distinctive clothing, religion could be an invisible status that someone may not know. Your socioeconomic status could also be invisible, right? So we are judged on visible things, we are judged on invisible things. And again, all of this can change. But what does not change, obviously, is skin color, right? So we may not be able to change that from day to day. So just like the video, the man turned out to be a judge, but he was being judged on his skin color first. All right, so yes, Casey, I think this is a good example that I model in terms of giving students an example, right? So we're, doing this exercise, we're having these conversations that hopefully will let students know that their privileges and disadvantages, their identities are being valued in our classrooms and hopefully in our content as well. All right, so if we're wrapping up a little bit with cultural competence or being a culturally competent instructor, now this is by no means a comprehensive list, but we're talking about instructors who value diversity, and with that, I would also say value equity and inclusion and social justice, have mechanisms in place to assess their levels of cultural competence. All right, so that would be that exercise. There are lots of other exercises and checklists and things. One is the implicit bias test that comes out of Harvard. There are lots of things and ways that we can kind of, get a benchmark of where we are, whether we acknowledge that that's where we are, and, ways to kind of get to where we think we might want to be. Now, culturally competent instructors are hopefully headed by culturally competent leaders who are conscious of the dynamics inherent when cultures interact. Now, I have a little asterisk there because we don't always work for people who are culturally competent or work for culturally competent organizations. Now, that's a whole other workshop, but just to acknowledge that this doesn't always permeate every dimension of an organization or department as we would like it to. So culturally competent instructors will be committed to continuous acquisition of cultural knowledge. All right, again, an ongoing, very dynamic process. You don't just become culturally competent in an hour and then remain so indefinitely. And culturally competent instructors should develop ways to adapt to and embrace diversity and promote equity inclusion in our classrooms. And as part of that, that's where the decolonizing the syllabus work comes into play. Now, just to be a little bit more practical in terms of, you might think, okay, well, how do we do this? And there are micro, meso, and macro levels in terms of how we might go about doing this work. So the micro level, this is kind of your internal work, your critical self-reflection, the reading that you do, the workshops that you attend, how you go about altering your content. So sometimes it could be a process of trial and error, but it is this work that you're doing within yourselves internally. So meso, as in middle, this is the work that you would be doing with your students or perhaps even your coworkers or your colleagues. Macro, right? So that's the largest level. This is the work that perhaps we're doing in a larger organization or in society at large. Now, specifically, just to kind of bring a little bit more context to this, micro work, again, is you're working with cultural competence and cultural humility. You're thinking about this whole decolonization process. That's all part of the micro work that you do. Your meso work could be the work that you do with your students, right? And so this is where those pedagogies that I mentioned at the top of the session, feminist pedagogy, culturally responsive pedagogy, anti-racist pedagogy. The pedagogy is how you might engage with your students and some of that work that you do within your classroom. And so some of this hopefully will result in a co-production of learning and knowledge as opposed to us staying at the front of the classroom as the sole experts in the room and just, spitting out facts and figures and things that students should take as gospel. Right? So they should be able to, in some way, bring themselves to the class, to the content, and they should be able to see themselves in our content and what we're presenting in the classroom. So for macro, maybe this is how we're working with community partnerships, how we're working in a social justice way to improve the greater society that we live in. All right, so we'll just conclude this section with a quote by Audre Lorde, who was an activist, a writer, a scholar, and she was actually also a librarian. She says, "It is not our differences that divide us, it is our inability to recognize, accept, and celebrate those differences." Now, just as a quick caveat, I've had people push back on this quote because they say they don't like the word celebrate. And they'll say, well, I can't celebrate that person's lifestyle because I don't approve of it, right? And this is usually going to be in relation to sexual orientation, gender identity, expression, etc. But it could be other things. And my response to that is, well, if you can't celebrate it, that's unfortunate, but you do have to respect it, right? Because you would want someone to respect your quote-unquote lifestyle choices that they may not agree with. Okay. All right, so I'm going to give you an example from some of my classroom experience, and I'm going to give it to you in a nutshell. If anyone's interested in kind of the long, drawn-out story, I have written about it, but I'd also be happy to talk offline about it. So again, I work in the School of Library and Information Science. I work with the folks who are working towards their library and information science graduate degrees. And so they could be going into any type of library. And most of them will be working with the public in some capacity. And so I was in a class, and typically when I teach, I am the only visible minority in the room. And so at a previous institution, it was a very non-diverse student body, which, is my profession as librarianship is also not very diverse. So in any case, I had an African-American female librarian come in as a guest speaker, and she was talking about how she led instruction sessions in her library. So she was working at a community college with a predominantly African American student body, and most of her students were returning adult students, right? So they were coming to her at night. And she was talking about how when she was doing her sessions, she's teaching people how to use databases and do research and, find the things that they need for their work. She would use examples from hip hop. So when she would search a database, she would search for Biggie Smalls and Tupac and things of that nature. And so her examples were meant to build rapport with her students, as well as impart some practical skills. And so she felt like if she could make them laugh or smile and really show how much she valued them by using examples from their life, she felt like that would help her better build relationships with them. So when they needed her help, they would actually come back to find her. So with all that said, she finished her lecture and she asked the students, well, what questions do you have? And the students in the room had no questions. It was just, crickets, silence. So she asked again. She said, does anyone have any questions? And so at this point, you could see that some of the students were actually visibly uncomfortable. And then finally, someone raised their hand and said, well, I don't think any of what you said is professional, and I don't think we should be doing this in the library. And so after being, devastated by that response, my guest speaker came in and she addressed the class before I could get a chance. And she said, it's never unprofessional to value your students and their experiences. They are the experts in their own needs. And I thought that was just a perfect way for her to address that. But what it comes down to in terms of our conversation about decolonizing the syllabus is that this student felt that using anything that wasn't quote unquote the canon or anything from quote unquote classic literature was unprofessional. Now, why did she think that? Lots of reasons, not the least of which is that that's how she was educated, that's how she was socialized, and that's what she thought was quote unquote good teaching versus quote unquote bad teaching. So part of this decolonization process is to kind of break down those barriers between quote unquote good and bad. Just because it was different, just because it was something that she had not previously experienced, doesn't mean that it wasn't valuable and doesn't mean that it didn't belong in a classroom. So after that particular instance, I really had to figure out for myself, how was I relating to my students? How was I thinking about my content versus what the students would actually take away from the class, right? So we can have conversations about hard topics. We can talk about racism, cultural competence. We can talk about any of these things, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee that students will know the actual value of this content or really understand how to practically apply this content when they leave our classrooms, right? So the student that I mentioned was discussing, I wasn't sure that they would know how to actually deal with diverse populations in their library, right? I mean, what probably would happen is that she would stick with Shakespeare and the canon and things of that nature. But, we want our students, no matter what discipline, to be able to be effective and compassionate people when they're dealing with others who are different from them. Another part of the decolonization process is talking to our students about hard conversations, purposefully having hard conversations. So as you return to classrooms this week, it might be, that you have to check in with your students. You might have to take 10 minutes out and, see how everyone's doing. Let people decompress, right? So this is, again, this is about more than your content. This is about us dealing with our students as human beings, right? So, sometimes we're reluctant to do these things because we've got 12 things that we need to do in the next 90 minutes. But maybe we only get to 8 things in this period because we need to check in with our students as human beings. We need to build and maintain the rapport that we have with them. So I want to give you just a very quick quote, and this again is coming from my discipline of librarianship. It's talking about transformative information services, but it really is talking about more fundamentally the power of information. So I highlighted what I thought were the most salient parts of this quote. This idea that we need to recognize that information is transformative and it really can transform our reality. And so this could be for us as instructors, but also the reality of our students, and could push one towards action for oneself. All right, so if, again, students can see themselves in our content, they can see themselves in the classroom, they can see themselves in the literature that we assign, representation matters. It gives that implicit validation that they and their experiences are important, right? And then that can transform how they move through the rest of the content, how they move through the rest of their education, how they move in the world. And then the last sentence, it identifies the transformative power of information. All right, again, it sounds cliche, we've all heard it, information is power, and how we have access to more than a singular story, right? We have access to more than a singular dominant narrative. We have access to so many different perspectives, different cultures, different religions, etc. And as much information as we can possibly absorb, that all works to forming who we are and forming what we can do with that information. A former administrator at another institution, I was talking to him about some of these ideas about decolonization, and he was pretty dismissive, and he said, well, and he taught computer science, and he said, well, you can't expect me to teach what you teach and use the same people that you use, because teaching computer science is very, very different than teaching Shakespeare. And I don't teach Shakespeare, but that's what came to his mind, right? And so my response to him was, okay, well, are you saying to me that, well, first I asked him, think about your syllabus, and is your syllabus comprised of all white men? And it took him a minute, and you could actually see, some of the wheels turning in his eyes. And he said, yeah, actually, I think they are all white men. But those are the classics. That's what we have to cover. And I said, okay, but are there any women that write in your field? Are there any people of color that write in your field that you can include their articles and their research in your syllabi to add dimension to what you're already teaching? And so by the end of the conversation, he nodded, and I think he got it. Now, again, he may have gotten it, but I'm fairly certain his syllabus never changed, right? So again, that's another dimension of this process between moving from theory to practice. All right, so I'm just going to go through a couple of slides here. I like to pull from social media to see what folks are talking about. And someone on social media said, if you're going to decolonize the university, you must address the structures and the policies and practices that minoritize those locked out of those spaces and those trapped within them. All right, so again, this points out to us that we are not doing this work in isolation. So if we talk about the actual, or some of the actual mechanics of how we might go about decolonizing our syllabus or our syllabi and our lectures, there are implicit and there are explicit ways of how we might do that. So implicitly might be what I just described to you, that someone adds different articles or different resources and materials to their syllabi that highlight and emphasize different voices and different perspectives. So again, you don't have to take out the quote-unquote canon, but it doesn't mean that you can't add in one or two more things that might provide a different perspective or might allow one of your students an opportunity to see themselves in your content. Because if they can see themselves in your content, they can better see themselves in the field, right? So if the person that I described earlier put in a woman or a person of color into their computer science syllabus, their student might say, oh, hey, there are women computer scientists. There are computer scientists that are people of color, right? And, you know, depending on their ambition, their level, other circumstances, you know, if they don't see themselves, maybe that's not the profession that they feel like they want to go into. So it all has a ripple effect. Other implicit ways are communicating the author's backgrounds, right? And this is not, you don't have to have like whole diversity conversations in your class, right? You could just maybe have their full name in your PowerPoint slide or however you present to your students. Maybe you have a picture of the author, right? That's one of the things that I tend to do, is have pictures of the scholars and the authors that we're studying that week. Linking to authors' institutional profile pages, right? So if they want to learn more, or if they want to see what else this person is doing, it's also a good way to find other scholars, you know, that might have diverse perspectives. There are also explicit ways to diversify our syllabi, lectures, content, etc. One of which is to have explicit conversations. So for example, in my discipline, Library and Information Science, there was a key African-American female scholar named Alfreda Chapman, and her work was groundbreaking for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is that she purposely focused on low socioeconomic people of color in her qualitative and ethnographic research, right? So I spend a whole unit on her, right? And I make sure the students know that if she had not paved the way, I would not be an LIS or a Library and Information Science college professor today, right? And so just kind of slipping in some of those details and really explicitly having these conversations about why this research matters, why this particular scholar matters, is a way that we can work towards decolonizing. Now, we also have to acknowledge the challenges that come with this work and come with us being educators in an institution of higher education. We are inherently gatekeepers, right? And so think about what is called the hidden curriculum. When we make choices for our syllabi and what we want to cover, those are purposeful choices. And when we don't include something on a syllabus, that could also be a purposeful choice. Now, I'm not talking about intentionality. I'm not talking about good, bad, malicious, or otherwise. I'm just saying if you decide you only have room for 6, that 7th article doesn't get put on, right? That is a decision. But is it always the 7th article that is the one that has some type of diversity or equity or inclusion baked within it, right? So we have to think about our role as gatekeepers. This work can be time consuming, right? So another challenge is actually having that time. Another challenge is actually feeling competent enough to discuss the topics, right? So in one way, you are all content experts. You're all disciplinary experts. So it shouldn't be difficult, I would hope. I hope it's not difficult to find diverse voices in your discipline. People of color, women, different folks who are writing in your discipline that you might be able to include their readings or their research. Now, it's a whole other kind of can of worms to talk about the larger topics, to talk about the context, right? And that's some of the work that will take practice, and some of the work that we might need to, you know, come together as a group in CTE or things of that nature and really, you know, figure out the skill set and be able to practice that skill set of being able to have those hard conversations. Um, there is, you may have heard of curriculum audits, right? That might be something that your department considers, because, I know a lot of people are working with syllabi that aren't necessarily their own creation. If we have these large classes that have multiple instructors, there has to be some consistency involved, right? But maybe if there's some type of audit, more diversity, more inclusive materials could be added across the board. For those who deal with literature and may actually have books in their classrooms, etc., do an audit of the books that you have. Do an audit of the books that you're assigning students to read, right? What is the composition? How many of these titles or texts are diverse? Are they giving the students an opportunity to either see themselves or to learn about a different perspective? Couple more things. These two suggestions are a little bit more fun, but they do the job. The Bechdel test, right, coming out of film. Alison Bechdel said, do your films have at least 2 women in them? Do these women talk to each other? And do they do something besides be with a man? All right, so, different contexts, but she's raising the point of, are women given substantive roles, or are they just tokens, right? So you want to be mindful of that when you're thinking about your content as well. You don't want to tokenize a perspective. If you're going to include it, you want to include it in a substantive way. Similar to that, you have the Gray test. This is named after Dr. Kashana Gray, and this is talking about people of color. Specifically, they're saying 2 non-white people that are written about substantively in an academic article, right? So again, you don't want to tokenize and just say, oh, well, I cited 6 people of color in my article. Citing versus talking about them substantively and giving credence to their work are 2 different things. So those are other things that we might think about when we're putting together our reading lists. I just want to start wrapping up, and I want to talk a little bit about language matters, right? And so we need to be precise in our language because it makes a difference. Language is impressionable, and if we are using the incorrect language, our students will use the incorrect language. And language is part of that whole socialization process, right? And we want to kind of push back against this Western socialization that we all have. So this is an academic example, Purdue in Indiana. The president said in some type of statement or press conference that he was hiring the rarest phenomenon. He was hiring this very rare creature, and he was talking about an African-American male professor. All right, so this was problematic on so many levels that we don't have time to get into. But why is it that he thought this African-American male was so rare, right? That speaks to the discrepancies in terms of hiring processes, the experiences of faculty of color, and whether or not they get tenured, promoted, et cetera, et cetera. There's lots and lots of literature about that, and we should probably have a workshop on that too. It affects student evaluations, and again, all of this context. But what becomes important here is that we need our faculties and our staffs to be more representative. So again, our students need to see themselves in us. Another example is, for those of you who watch reality television, the kind of game show America's Got Talent, African-American actress Gabrielle Union, who is pictured here, was a judge for a season, and she parted ways, and it's been very contentious. And she says that she was calling out racism and other isms that were happening behind the scenes at this show, and were serving to disenfranchise some of the contestants. And because she dared to point something out, she was fired and then immediately labeled as difficult. Right? So again, these are stereotypes. So if you hear someone talking about your students or your colleagues or what have you, oh, she's really difficult. Oh, she doesn't fit in. Oh, she's angry all the time. think about what that means, and think about how language is our first way to otherize, other or marginalize other people. All right, and so these are some of the things that we need to be thinking about as we're trying to be inclusive in our content. So I am going to give you homework, right, in the hypothetical sense, if you will. But I am sincerely hoping that you will take this opportunity to think about your syllabi, the classes that you teach, the classes that you think you might want to teach in the future, and think about what voices are missing from your syllabi, what voices are missing from your reading lists, and how can you change that? What can you add? Along those lines, do your lectures present a single story, or do they present diverse perspectives and diverse information needs? Right? And you could actually tie this into perhaps questions of pedagogy. Are there dimensions of culturally responsive pedagogy that you could incorporate? And culturally responsive pedagogy, in a very, very, very tiny nutshell, is you pulling on the experiences and valuing the experiences and incorporating the experiences of your diverse students into your curriculum, right? Are there ways that you can do that? Are there ways that you can engage in anti-racist pedagogy, right? And, I should have said this earlier, but small things make a difference, right? So you don't have to make these sweeping changes in your lectures or in your content or in your syllabi. Small things matter, right? So, sometimes it can be really overwhelming to say, oh, I have to be a feminist pedagogue now. No, not necessarily. But are there tenets or are there strategies that you can pull to incorporate into the work that you're already doing? And then finally, do the instructors in your department, in your college, at the University of South Carolina as a whole, do we present a single story, or do we present diverse perspectives and diverse information needs? And that could lead into a department's hiring, how you might undergo training to be inclusive and equitable in the hiring process. Think about how people are onboarded into a department or into a school or college. Think about retention, right? The retention of marginalized faculty is surely not as high as it should be, right? So again, just to give you an idea of how contextual all of this is. All right, so I'm going to leave you with a question of how do you want to be remembered as an instructor? All right, so do you want to be that instructor, that just pounded this information into students and you kind of made them hate the subject, or you made them drop out, right? I have several of those that I could tell you about from my undergraduate days. Or are you the professor that opened someone's mind, that opened someone's perspective, and put them on the path to equity and inclusion, right? So just think about your legacy, if you will. All right, so the last two slides, empowerment comes from ideas, and it's our job as instructors to present new ideas, diverse ideas, in an effort to empower our students. And then finally, are you helping? Are you hurting? Right, so it's a very basic question that could be applied to many, many different things in life. But obviously, we're specifically talking about the classroom. And as someone typed in the last discussion question pod, am I empowering them, I'm trying to empower my students and give them confidence to let them know that they can make change in the world. All right, and with that said, I'd like to thank you for your time today. It's been an honor to spend some time with you, and I hope this was helpful, and just to let you know that this is something that I think about all the time and have spent semesters really trying to figure out the best way to decolonize and be as inclusive and as possible in my own work in teaching. No, just to remind folks, this is an ongoing process, and just like everything else, please don't get overwhelmed. Again, it's about the small steps, and this is about us actually growing and learning with our students. And just a quick shout out to CTE for the webinars and the sessions that really encourage us to be more inclusive in our teaching.